I'm on the moon. I'm on the moon. And the excitement, the wonder, the thrill, the adventure of it all, and as Buzz Aldrin described it, it was this magnificent desolation.
12 men walked on the moon. All of them came back changed. Most stayed quiet, and the ones who didn't were dismissed or ignored. Charles Duke was different. He was the voice Houston trusted most, the man Armstrong and Aldrin heard when they landed. When Duke went to the moon himself, he stopped the rover and stared at something that had no right to exist. A 100-meter wall, angular blocks built on a world where nothing has ever been built. He photographed it and reported it to Houston. Houston went silent for 30 seconds, then told him to move on. Those photographs have never been released. At 89, he's done keeping quiet. What he's saying now is the reason we never went back. The voice they built to be believed. July 20th, 1969. An estimated 600 million people were watching their televisions. Two men were about to touch down on the moon for the first time in human history, and the entire moment rested on a single voice holding it together. That voice belonged to Charles Duke. As Capcom, Duke was the one person Armstrong and Aldrin heard during the landing. Not the flight director, not the NASA administrator, just Duke, steady, controlled, giving nothing away. When Armstrong radioed back, "The Eagle has landed," Duke's response went out to the whole world. Calm, dry, exactly what the moment needed. He didn't get that role by accident. Duke was handpicked from thousands of applicants through one of the most demanding selection processes ever designed. Air Force test pilot, MIT master's degree. He had worked directly on the Apollo guidance and navigation system before he ever sat in a spacecraft. NASA wasn't casting for personality. It was building a team of human instruments, men so precise and reliable that every word they said could be trusted without question. Duke fit that requirement perfectly. The psychological screening alone was extraordinary. NASA's evaluators were specifically trying to filter out anyone whose mind might crack under pressure or report things that weren't real. Every candidate went through extensive psychiatric testing designed to identify men with stable, accurate perception. Duke passed every single test. That certification matters more than people realize, because it means that everything Duke would later describe came from a man NASA's own experts had cleared as psychologically sound and incapable of fabrication. 3 years after Apollo 11, Duke got his own mission. Apollo 16, April 1972. He and Commander John Young landed in the Descartes Highlands, spent 71 hours on the surface, and covered miles of terrain no human had ever seen. They ran every experiment on the schedule, collected hundreds of pounds of lunar samples, and completed every assigned objective. NASA's official assessment was glowing. One of the most successful missions ever flown. That is the version that made it into the record books. What happened after the mission is harder to explain. Duke was never assigned to another flight. He left NASA within 2 years of returning from the moon, and the reasons he gave publicly never fully added up. The most trusted voice in the program simply stepped away, quietly, with no clear explanation, and the institution never offered one either. Think about that for a second. NASA spent years engineering a man to be the gold standard of credibility. They placed him in the most trust-critical role in the program, and then, after he came back from the moon, he was gone. No next mission, no formal explanation. The institution that built Duke to be believed ended up spending the next 50 years making sure as few people as possible heard what he had to say. Everything that follows needs to be understood with that in mind. But the official record of Apollo 16 and what actually unfolded on that surface are two completely different stories. And the gap between them starts not with what Duke discovered, but with what began happening to him the moment he stepped off the ladder. When the moon started breaking the rules. Go back and watch the unedited Apollo 16 mission recordings, not the highlight reels NASA packaged for documentaries, the full, uncut footage. And something is wrong. There are moments where Duke freezes completely mid-step, not stumbling, not adjusting his footing, just stopped, standing perfectly still, staring at something outside the camera's frame, something the lens never captures. Young's voice crackles through the radio. "Charlie, you okay?" Duke replies, barely audible. "Fine, just looking." His voice sounds distant, like a man trying to process something his entire career never prepared him for. The mission transcripts do not say what he was looking at, The post-mission reports do not mention it. Duke himself did not speak about it publicly for 4 decades, until around 2015, when he began describing things that have no place in any official record. The first thing he described was the light. On the moon, sunlight should be pure white. No atmosphere means no scattering, and no scattering means no color variation. That is not debatable. It is basic physics. But Duke was seeing blues and purples drifting across the surface with no explanation he could find. Then came the sounds. Sound cannot travel through a vacuum. Every physicist, every engineer, every test pilot understands this at a foundational level. There is simply no physical mechanism for it. But Duke began hearing tones, not through the radio, not through any vibration from his suit. Actual frequencies, sometimes harmonic and almost musical, sometimes dissonant in a way he found deeply unsettling. He turned to Young and asked if he could hear it. Young said yes. 2 of the most technically educated, rigorously trained test pilots alive, both hearing something that the laws of physics say cannot exist. Then time broke. For a trained pilot, the mission clock is sacred. It is the last thing you doubt. Duke would complete a task, check his timer, and discover that 20 minutes had vanished when it had felt like 2. Then the reverse. 5 minutes on the clock, feeling like a full hour. At one point, he radioed Houston and reported that he and Young had been at a specific location for approximately 2 minutes. The mission clock showed 20. And then, when the light was wrong and the sounds were impossible and the clock could no longer be trusted, something else arrived. Duke has described a presence that was there from the moment they stepped onto the surface. Not Young, not Houston, something else. He described it as vast and aware, patient in a way that felt ancient, like something enormous was watching them the way you watch an insect that has crawled onto your hand, with total attention and no concern whatsoever for whether they understood what was happening to them. It never left. It was not tied to any specific location on the surface. It was simply always there, from the first step to the moment they sealed the hatch. After their final EVA, Duke and Young sat inside the sealed lunar module and compared notes. The colors, the sounds, the clock, the presence, every detail matched between the 2 of them, independently. 2 of the most rigorously evaluated observers in the history of space exploration, sitting in agreement about experiences that had no scientific category, no protocol, and no column on any debrief form NASA had ever designed. They agreed on everything, and they reported none of it, because there was no version of that conversation that did not immediately end both their careers. What they experienced was real, but it was subjective, hard to prove, easy for NASA to stamp as mission stress and bury permanently without a second look. What happened on the 3rd EVA could not be buried, because what happened on the 3rd EVA was physical, concrete, and photographed. And it is the real reason we never went back. The structure in the highlands. 6 kilometers from the lunar module, with Earth completely out of sight behind the ridge above them, Duke and Young were doing routine work, collecting geological samples, checking boxes. The mission clock was running normally, and everything was on schedule. There was nothing unusual about the moment before Duke looked toward the horizon. Then something was wrong with the shapes. The moon does not produce straight lines. Everything on its surface, every crater, every boulder, every ridge, is the result of billions of years of random meteorite impacts. Nothing is regular. Nothing has clean edges. That is not a matter of opinion. It is simply what the moon is. So, when Duke saw geometry on that horizon, lines too straight and angles too uniform to have been made by any natural process, he did not immediately speak. Neither did Young. The radio stayed open but silent. Just 2 men on a rover, staring at something that should not be there. They drove closer. As the distance closed, what had looked wrong from far away became something else entirely up close. A wall, a foundation, angular blocks covered in thick lunar dust, uniform in a way that geology never produces, fitted together in a way that erosion never creates. At close range, there was no ambiguity. The structure was roughly 100 meters long, disappearing into the ground at both ends, as if what they were seeing was only the top of something far larger that the moon had been slowly swallowing for an unimaginable stretch of time. The blues and purples they had been seeing throughout the mission were stronger here, shifting across the surface of the blocks. The tones they had been hearing were louder and now almost directional, as if the structure itself was producing them. The dust at the base of the wall was harder and more compacted than anywhere else they had worked, as though the surface had spent an enormous amount of time solidifying around whatever was sitting on top of it. Then Duke noticed the temperature inside his suit had dropped several degrees, with no mechanical reason for it. Young's had done the same. And then Duke described something that appears in no official record. One section of the wall was emitting a faint light with no identifiable source, not reflected sunlight, not instrument glare, something coming from within the material itself. And from that same section, he began hearing voices, not static, not radio interference. Actual voices, men and women layered over each other, speaking in what sounded like multiple languages at the same time. They were not distorted or strange. They sounded like completely ordinary human voices coming from inside the wall itself. And then one voice pulled slightly away from the rest. Duke has said it sounded like it was saying his name. He turned away from the wall and keyed his radio. "Houston, we have a geometric formation here. It is not natural. It appears constructed, approximately 100 meters in length. We are requesting guidance." He released the key and waited. 1 second passed, then another. The standard signal delay between the moon and Earth is 1.3 seconds. Duke knew that interval the way he knew his own heartbeat. He had spent years on the other side of it. This was not that. 5 seconds went by, then 10. Duke and Young looked at each other through their visors. 15 seconds, 20. Duke keyed the radio again. "Houston, do you copy?" Nothing. 25 seconds. 30. The only sounds were his own breathing inside the helmet, the steady hiss of the oxygen system, and the faint static of an open channel that no one on the other end was filling. He looked back at the structure. Still there. Still real. Still impossible. When the response finally came, it was not what either of them expected. The voice was flat, controlled, and completely without emotion. No shock, no urgency, no questions. "Roger, continue with planned EVA sample collection activities." That was it. The complete response to 2 astronauts reporting apparent constructed structures on the surface of the moon. No request for description, no follow-up, no acknowledgement of what had just been said. Just a calm, prepared instruction to move on. Before Houston could repeat the order, Duke and Young photographed everything. Dozens of images, close-ups of the individual blocks, wide shots showing the full length of the structure against the horizon. Context, photographs from every angle they could manage. Duke pressed the shutter himself and has described every image as crystal clear, with nothing wrong with the exposures. Those photographs have never been released, not one of them. Duke has been asking NASA about them for decades, and the explanation keeps changing. Classified for technical reasons, lost during archival transfer, image quality too degraded for public release. Every answer is different, and none of them hold up against basic scrutiny. Duke has described his reaction not as frustration, but as fury. Not the feeling of a man who lost something. The fury of a man who knows exactly where those images are and cannot prove it. He says with complete certainty that they are sitting in a vault somewhere, cataloged, accessible to someone, buried under 50 years of institutional silence that has never once been formally explained. The wall, the voices, the missing photographs, the 30 seconds of silence before a suspiciously calm response. All of it is disturbing. But Duke has said plainly that none of that is actually the most unsettling part. The most unsettling part is what the physical condition of those blocks revealed about how long they had been sitting there. And when he explains that, everything shifts. Older than everything. In a 2019 interview, Duke was asked directly whether the structures looked recent. He shook his head slowly. The blocks were eroded and worn down in ways that should not be possible on a world with no wind, no rain, and no weather of any kind. They were covered in micrometeorite impact craters, the kind that only accumulate through millions of years of continuous bombardment from space, possibly hundreds of millions of years. Geologists refer to that specific erosion pattern as saturation cratering, a state where a surface has been bombarded so long that new craters simply overlap old ones. On the moon, reaching that level of saturation requires approximately 500 million years of continuous exposure. Duke was not describing ancient ruins in the way people typically imagine ruins. He was describing something that had been sitting on the moon for longer than complex animal life has existed on Earth. The oldest human structures on Earth, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey and the megalithic temples of Malta are at most 12,000 years old. Whatever Duke was standing in front of makes those look like they were built yesterday. The period when whatever constructed those blocks was alive and capable falls inside an era when Earth had no land animals, no forests, and no complex life of any kind. They built on the moon while Earth was still a world of shallow seas and microscopic organisms. Which means, according to some researchers, they may have watched everything from up there. The entire history of complex life on Earth, from the first fish to the first forests, to the first humans who eventually built rockets and flew up to look at what they had left behind. The moon is close enough to observe Earth clearly, stable enough to last geological timescales, and quiet enough that nothing would disturb whatever was placed there. Some scientists who study the origin of life have pointed out that the lunar surface would be a structurally perfect long-term observation post for anything monitoring Earth over vast stretches of time. And then they were simply gone. No confirmed trace anywhere else. No signal. No secondary site. Nothing except this one partially exposed wall being slowly swallowed by the lunar surface. They built something that survived 500 million years of bombardment and then vanished completely. Duke has said plainly that NASA understands what those erosion patterns mean, and they made the decision that the public should not. Duke was not the only one who came back from the moon carrying something he could not explain and could not report. In 2017, most of the surviving moonwalkers gathered privately for the first time. What was said in that room changes the entire shape of this story. The ones who came back, different. In 2017, most of the surviving Apollo moonwalkers gathered privately. These were old men in their 80s, the only living human beings who had ever stood on another world. According to Duke, it was the first time any of them said it out loud in the same room. Every single one of them had experienced anomalies. Different things, different missions, none of it matching what NASA had told the public. They had protected their reputations for decades by staying silent, but they were in their final years now, and the weight of saying nothing had finally become heavier than the weight of saying something. These were not unstable men chasing attention. These were decorated military officers and PhD scientists, selected from thousands of candidates, trusted by the United States government with the most classified technology and the most dangerous missions in human history. By any standard of credibility that exists, these were the most qualified witnesses on Earth to describe what the moon actually is. And in their final years, independently across different missions and different decades, every one of them arrived at the same conclusion. Buzz Aldrin, the second human being to walk on the moon, publicly described a monolith-like structure on Phobos, one of Mars' moons, and stated it required serious and immediate investigation. He did not hedge, he did not qualify it. When the interviewer offered him a way out, he did not take it. Edgar Mitchell came back from Apollo 14 in 1971 and was never the same. During re-entry, he reported experiencing a sudden and completely overwhelming sense of connection to something vast and non-human, something he spent the rest of his life trying to explain through science. He founded the Institute of Noetic Sciences because of it. In his final years, he stated plainly, not as speculation, but as fact, that extraterrestrial intelligence is real and that governments have known about it for decades. Interviewers repeatedly offered him softer ground to stand on. He never moved. What Mitchell described during re-entry, something vast, patient, and aware, matches in precise detail what Duke and Young reported feeling on the surface during Apollo 16. Two different men, two different missions, one in orbit and one on the ground, describing contact with the same thing. Al Worden orbited the moon on Apollo 15 and never set foot on the surface. He told an interviewer directly that he believed humans descended from beings who originated somewhere other than Earth. The interviewer laughed. Worden did not. He was a command module pilot and a decorated Air Force officer, not a man given to dramatic statements. He said it and he meant it. Neil Armstrong almost never gave public interviews after Apollo 11. He turned down request after request for decades. The man who made the single most significant step in human history spent the rest of his life refusing to discuss it in any real depth. His family has said privately that the moon changed him in ways he never fully put into words. Shortly before his death, he made a public reference to secrets still buried beneath the surface. Armstrong was not known as a man who spoke in metaphors. Gordon Cooper, one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, sent a formal letter to the United Nations in 1978, stating that extraterrestrial craft had been tracked and recovered, and that governments had deliberately suppressed the information. He named specific incidents. He requested an official investigation. The letter was received, acknowledged, and filed. No investigation was ever opened. Cooper spent the remainder of his life insisting the cover-up was real and reached the highest levels of government. One man saying these things can be dismissed. Two can be called coincidence. But every moonwalker independently across different missions and different decades, all arriving at the same place, that is not confusion or stress or the psychological toll of dangerous work. That is a pattern. And these were men whose entire careers were built on recognizing exactly that. If that many credentialed independent men all came back carrying the same silence for decades, then the decision to stop going to the moon was not a budget problem. It was a deliberate choice. Someone made it, and here is exactly what that choice looked like and what it required. Why we stopped. In 2023, someone asked Duke directly whether there was a cover-up. He called it institutional paralysis. NASA, he said, is sitting on data, photographs, and observations from multiple missions that would fundamentally challenge what the public believes about the moon, about whether we are alone, and about whether human history as we understand it is the complete picture. Releasing it would not spark a difficult conversation. It would detonate everything. So year after year, decade after decade, they sit on it. Not out of malice, in Duke's framing, out of something smaller and more human. The unwillingness to be the institution that destroys what everyone believes. But that framing, honest as it is, does not go far enough. Paralysis is inaction born of fear. What Houston did during Apollo 16 was not paralysis. The response that came back after 30 seconds of silence was flat, controlled, and completely prepared. Continue with planned EVA sample collection activities. That is not the language of a room that was caught off guard. That is protocol. And protocol means that before Apollo 16 ever launched, someone sat in a room and wrote a procedure for exactly that scenario. The decision to suppress what Duke found was not made in that silence. It was made before the mission left the ground. Apollo ended with Apollo 17 in December 1972. 4 years, 12 men on the moon, and then a complete stop. No gradual wind down, no replacement program, just a hard end. 3 months later, NASA canceled Apollo 18, 19, and 20, missions with hardware already built and crews partially trained. The official reason was budget, but the Saturn V rockets built for those canceled missions were not scrapped or sold for parts. They were placed in museums, intact and whole. You do not preserve hardware from a program you canceled to save money. You liquidate it. Reports from several astronauts who trained for those canceled flights describe receiving specific classified briefings about what the surface missions had found, followed by direct instructions never to discuss what they had been told. Someone built the system that buried what Duke found. Someone ran it for 50 years. Someone is still running it now. Duke is 89 years old. He walked on the moon, reported what he found, watched the evidence disappear, and spent 50 years carrying something the rest of the world was never supposed to know. He is not asking anyone to believe him. He is simply the man who was there, and he is telling you what he saw before he no longer can. NASA has had 50 years to release those photographs. They have not. They have had 50 years to give one consistent explanation for where those images went. They cannot. At some point, the silence itself becomes the answer. Whatever is sitting in the Descartes Highlands has been there for 500 million years. It was there before the first human being drew breath. It will be there long after every person alive today is gone. The only thing that has ever changed is that one man decided the world deserved to know it exists. Think about what it means that the institution which sent him there is still, to this day, making sure you cannot see it with your own eyes. And ask yourself this: if the photographs showed nothing, why has it taken them 50 years and 4 different explanations to say so?